Okay, so I've talked about this on a few episodes since rebranding the show. Podcast SEO was an absolute necessity for me with my podcast. As you go back in the archives, the show was called Let's Blow This Up. And despite playing with different taglines and trying to put the word podcast or podcasting shoehorned into the title, I just couldn't make the show as visible as I needed it to be. So I made the decision to rebrand, and Podcasting Strategy Simplified, as you know the show to be today, was born. And I can say now at this point, we're a couple months into this. I'm not a person that's all about fast results, but I can tell you I have seen some changes. And today I want to unpack some of these changes, as well as why you need to put more emphasis on podcast SEO for your show as well. And for this conversation, I didn't want to do this alone because there was a person that played a small role in helping me move my efforts forward. So I want to give her her flowers, but also give her an opportunity to share with you all of her vast knowledge on podcast SEO. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome to Podcasting Strategy Simplified, Julia Levine. What's going on, Julia?
Hey, Jason. So happy to be here with you.
I am thrilled that you were able to take the time to join me because, as I said, a little bit of backstory here. When I went to PodFest in 2026, earlier this year, I went with several missions, but one of them for my own purposes was to attend some talks and presentations and just overall mingle with some people in the podcast space about what I should do with my show. And should I be going down this rebranding path? I feel like that's the right move, but I'm just not sure. And by coincidence, the very first Pecha Kucha event that I attended, and for those that don't know, those are little 5-minute presentations all grouped together. Julia was one of the first ones to speak on that stage, and she dove into podcast SEO and immediately made me realize this is what I need to do. And I remember sitting in that session making notes because I was convinced from that. I was like, I don't even need to talk to anybody else. I know I need to do this. So, Julia, let's talk about your ventures in the podcast space, but ultimately what brought you so close to this podcast SEO subject and what really made you realize the importance of it for all podcasters?
Well, I first just have to say thank you so much for your kind words about my presentation. It was so difficult to craft a meaningful 5-minute presentation. As podcasters, we like to talk.
Yeah, you'd think that would be easy, right? But probably even harder than doing a 30-minute presentation.
Hardest presentation I've ever given in my life. Absolutely, hands down. So to hear you say, that you were taking notes, you found it valuable, that is just so meaningful to me. So thank you for that.
You are welcome.
And the reason I got into podcast SEO and why it is just my absolute passion in the podcasting world is honestly because I'm an introvert and marketing exhausts me.
I understand that.
I was getting so burnt out of trying to what I think of as chasing listeners. I'm trying to post, I'm trying to email, I'm trying to network with people and talk. And even when I'm not talking to another human face to face, it's still, if you're trying to record something for social media, you're still quote unquote on. And it's just a lot of energy. And as an introvert, I was finding that it was just sucking up so much of my precious energy. And I was like, there's got to be a better way and a way for people to come to me rather than me going out and chasing all these people and saying, come listen to my show, come listen to my show.
Yeah.
And so I had heard about, regular SEO for Google, your website and everything. And I knew that it didn't work the same way on podcast players, but there is not a lot of information out there about podcast SEO.
Yeah.
And so I learned from a couple different sources and I really just started experimenting and testing things. And I found some strategies that really seem to have worked. And some of the podcast world has caught on by now. This was a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
But it's just such a a powerful tool, and a lot of the information out there that says it's about podcast SEO is really just about Google SEO, but
Right.
about your podcast content, like turning it into a blog post or something like that. So
Yeah.
it's not really podcast player, podcast search optimization. And so I think that's a difference to highlight.
I agree. And I think while you bring that subject up, it's the perfect time to dive into this. What is the difference or the major differences between, I guess we can define it as regular SEO, what you would do with Google versus what you should be doing with podcast SEO?
Yeah, absolutely. Google SEO, regular SEO is obviously designed for your website and, pages on the internet, and it's designed for Google. Podcast, obviously for the podcast players, we're talking Apple and Spotify primarily. Of course, there are others out there, but those are the two that we mostly think about and like study their algorithms. And then when it comes to Google SEO, you want to use a variety of keywords. So I'm working on my website right now, and my SEO instructor, my SEO coach, is very particularly instructing me not to use the same long tail keyword phrases multiple places. So if I do a blog post, like that is the one single blog post that I am targeting that phrase for. And so I don't want to make a second blog post about that topic and target the same phrase for search engine optimization, because then I'd be competing with myself essentially to rank on Google.
Yeah.
And so podcast player SEO is the exact opposite. So you want to have that repetition. You want to keep using the same words. You don't want a lot of variety. So that is the biggest difference, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And then also, it just works so much faster. So Google SEO, regular SEO, it can take at minimum months, sometimes years, to build that authority to get Google to pick up on you. And podcast SEO, it works in just a few weeks, a month, 2 months. You're seeing dramatic results. I think you've seen that yourself as well, right?
The best example I can give of this was, again, show was called Let's Blow This Up. Despite any tagline that I put together that might start with the word podcasting or contain podcasting somewhere in it, I never was breaking into that. If you just went and searched podcasting or podcasts on podcasting, nowhere to be found was my show. Within 1 month of making the show Podcasting Strategy Simplified, again, keyword was the first word. I'm consistent. I mean, I appeared for the first time in that Google search under the top shows, and now I am slowly but surely moving my way up, because that's one of the things that is funny about this to me, and this might not be podcast SEO centric, but some of the shows that are listed under podcasting it's ridiculous. They're not about podcasting. Call Me Daddy was there today. I'm like, why is this shoehorned in here? I mean, it's a big show, obviously, but it's not about podcasting. It's just a podcast. So get out of our lane, Alex. Anyway.
Well, and I think that's one of the unique things about our field specifically, is because so many podcasters tack on the word podcast. I don't know if Alex does this, but like the Call Her Daddy podcast or the Simple Weight Loss podcast.
Sure.
And they have the word podcast in their title. And so that confuses the algorithm about what it's about. So that's kind of a challenge that's unique to us, but it absolutely makes a huge difference what word you're using and where you're putting that word.
Before we move on to that, because I think that's important, let's talk about this, because 2026, as we put this episode together, I mean, I think overall we've cracked over 5 million podcasts that have come out. There aren't that many that are active, but do you feel, this is one of those personal things to me, that the word podcast is still needed? Like you, in the context of which you said it, like I'm making raviolis podcast. I like tennis podcast. I don't think it's necessary. does it have any impact on SEO? Is it something that I mean, there was one I can't remember it was the something about podcast, or it was the podcast about something podcast. I'm like, come on now. How many times do you need to say the word? We get it. You've got a podcast. So I'm in that school of thought that Podcasting Strategy Simplified is different because that's exactly what we're talking about, podcasting strategy. But if I called it Let's Blow This Up Podcast before, that felt unnecessary to me. What are your thoughts?
I 100% agree. And I tell all of my students, do not put the word podcast in your title of record. If you want to put it on your cover art for whatever reason, you feel the need to do that, fine. But do not put it in that official title field that is what the algorithm is searching. Yeah. Because like we just said, so many people tack it on there, which means that it's no longer meaningful. Yeah. And if they're already in their podcast player app searching for a podcast, we don't need to identify that it's a podcast.
Thank you for saying that, because that was always my main take, is like, how many times do you have to beat somebody over the head with it before they just say, I got it. It's a podcast. You don't have to keep telling me.
Yeah. I do run into students sometimes where they already have a good business name that clearly represents their topic, and they want to name their podcast the same thing for brand cohesiveness. And so they want to call it so for my example, my client, Lisa, her business is Smart Weight Loss Coaching. Yeah. And so her podcast is now the Smart Weight Loss Coaching Podcast. So when she talks about it, she talks about the Smart Weight Loss Coaching Podcast. And that makes sense in that context to differentiate it. But the word podcast is not in her official title of record, even though that's how she verbally refers to it.
Yeah. That's an interesting point to talk about, because I know I had a similar client in the past that I'm no longer working with that had a podcast. We started it with the business name, and it was the business name podcast. And before long, she got bored with it and she wanted to change it. And we did. And when we changed it, it's not like much change, because I mean, to look at the grand scope, it just wasn't around long enough to really have any big breakthroughs. There were a couple, and I think it helped connect her to a few people, but overall it just didn't serve the total purpose. But I enjoyed working on the show, and I thought the content was great. But I wondered, in making that change, if it was that moving away from where we need to be in regards to discoverability, because it went from the name of the business, which maybe it could play a factor in overall SEO or regular SEO. But those cutesy names, again, I'm an example. Let's blow this up. No one had a friggin' clue unless I told them this is a show about podcasting strategy and all the things you need to know to launch a good podcast. No one knows that when they discover it. So I've always had that thought, and I think it leads perfectly into the subject of direct is better than cute.
100%.
Like, if you are thinking which way is the better way to go with the way that's going to get you discovered versus the one that's going to make you sound clever.
Yes.
Your thoughts?
Absolutely, 100% agree. And this is the biggest point of resistance for people, because a lot of folks have spent months or years dreaming about their podcast, and usually they have some kind of an inkling of an idea of a title, or I'm sure we'll get to this later, they have already used this title and they're super attached to it, and they don't want to let go of it. And I find in a lot of cases, they have some kind of emotional connection to the title. Yeah. And what I like to tell people is that you can channel all that cutesy creativity, all of that creative energy into your content, but your title brings people to the door. So, if you think about houses, the house across the street from me is on the market. So this is just first example that popped into my head, but it could be the best house in the world on the inside. But if it's not attractive, not clear on the outside, maybe it's a little run down or something like that, it has a weird paint color. No one's going to know how amazing it is on the inside because they're not going to give it a chance.
Right.
And so maybe that's not the best comparison there, but
it makes sense.
Yeah.
It really does. I see a podcast name, Let's Blow This Up. I don't know what that means. I mean, I, as in me, I knew what it meant. It was a direct extension and a perfect complement to my brand name, Bombtrack, all the things. But again, I was so wrapped up with the brand compliment that I didn't even consider, what if this show is hard to find? What if the general person that's looking for podcast knowledge looks up podcasting, doesn't find the show, or even worse, does find it and scrolls right past it because it isn't clear. And it's easy to sit in this chair now and say this was the right move, but for a while I was hesitant because I thought the name worked perfectly, and keep plugging and keep putting out content and keep talking about this. And I had a couple of the SEO strategies in place, but they, like titles, I always was very focused on SEO titles for my show. But the fact that there was no SEO with the name of the show or the show description that really told that story, it made them less strong and ultimately led to the lack of visibility that I faced. So,
yeah. And because I know there's probably going to be someone out there listening who is going to, think, well, there are plenty of successful shows out there that don't have clear titles, because I get that rebuttal a lot.
Sure.
I just want to address that point kind of preemptively and say that those people who have successful shows without a very clear SEO friendly name usually have something else working for them. So they have name recognition, or they have a huge following already that they are bringing to their podcast. So they have 1 million followers on social media already. Very easy to grow a podcast when you're starting with that. Yeah. Or they have a marketing team where they love marketing. And so that's, they're constantly doing that. And so I think SEO, podcast SEO is powerful for anyone, but especially for those of us that don't have name recognition, don't have marketing teams, don't want to spend all day marketing and chasing listeners, and who, are trying to build an audience. We're not bringing an existing audience with us.
First podcast that comes to mind with that mentality or that mindset around it is Good Hang. Anybody could have a podcast with the name Good Hang, but you add Amy Poehler to that title, and all of a sudden, Amy Poehler's podcast. Yeah, millions are going to show up and listen to that because it's Amy Poehler. So none of us are that.
Exactly.
I think it's safe to say, unless somebody famous is listening to the show, and for that I apologize. I'm downplaying your fame and fortune, but overall, I think the majority of folks that join us here on Podcasting Strategy Simplified are thinking more about, what can I do to get discovered? And it's not about getting discovered by millions. It's about getting discovered by the right group of people that are ultimately going to help them achieve the goals that they have, whether that's monetization around the show or selling their product or service, whatever the case is for their particular goal set. The SEO side of it is enormous. And I think that's the first thing that should be talked about. And I like that this subject is becoming more prevalent. Because when you think about, I lost a couple years of potential traction. No way of going backwards and saying, oh yeah, I would be here. I don't know, but still I can just see, based on what I've been experiencing over the past couple months since I did rebrand the show versus what I did in the first couple of years, had a hell of a lot of fun creating the content, but it just wasn't as visible as it could have been. So I think that's SEO is something we all have to be thinking about right on the front end of things.
Yes. And I want to hone in on something you just said there about it bringing in the right people, the right listeners, because when your title is clear, it improves the fit between your content and your audience. And so that's going to lead to people sticking around longer. And when the algorithm, those bots that are working behind the scenes, when they see someone who finds your show, Let's Blow This Up, they click on it. They're like, what's this about? Oh, it's about podcasting strategy. Oh, that's not at all what I'm interested in. And they click out. That tells the algorithm this podcast wasn't worth listening to.
Right.
And so it is detrimental. So when someone searches, finds a podcast that seems aligned, and then they click on it and it actually is aligned, and so they continue listening, that not only tells the algorithm, hey, this was exactly what this person was looking for when they typed in the search, which of course is going to boost you up in the search results. It also works on that conversion piece. So my podcast is Podcasting for Solopreneurs. And so I work with mostly small business owners, and they're all about turning their listeners into clients. And so ultimately, we want those people to make a purchase. And so the journey of discovering the podcast, I call it attraction, retention, conversion. So, you attract someone to the podcast, you retain them, you keep them sticking around, and then you convert them. But you can't have that retention piece or the conversion piece unless you're attracting the right people in the first place.
100%. That's, I think, that if anything blends regular SEO, again, I keep using that term, versus podcast SEO, and puts it all together in one cohesive thought, that's it. That's the same when you land on a website and within 3 seconds, well, this wasn't what I was looking for, and you click out, that's telling the algorithm this wasn't what the person's looking for, therefore this is not relevant to the search query.
Correct.
Same thing here. And that's where we have such a great opportunity with podcasting. And I think that sometimes we take it for granted what we can accomplish when we truly follow this path from A to Z the way that we should. And sometimes I've talked about this on past episodes here on the show, that we put these invisible barriers that we're not intending to put up, but we do. We prevent somebody from really experiencing the words that we have to share, and maybe even the knowledge they need to move the needle, because, for one, based on our subject today, that we aren't set up to get discovered. And they're finding somebody else that they're getting that tutelage from. Sometimes we set ourselves up to get discovered, and that part's working great, but then they click play and it's just a bunch of ads, and it's a 10-minute intro, and 20 minutes into the show, they haven't even started talking about the reason why the person clicked play in the first place. So I love working this subject into the very beginning, especially with a couple of clients I've started working to since I started taking it more seriously, or a couple of clients I've started working with, just making sure that they understood the importance of this and how it plays into the overall factor of everything that they're doing. And I think now is the time. Boy, I hate to, there are ways to say this delicately, but if you are in a place where you feel like your show is not delivering the results that you need, it's time to recalibrate and potentially go down that path of rebranding. It may seem daunting, but I can say firsthand, it's absolutely what you need to do if you feel that what you've put in place is not getting you to where you need to be. What do you say to that, Julia?
Absolutely agree with you. Every single one of my students, coaching clients who comes to me and says, hey, my podcast, it's just not growing the way I want. I'm not reaching listeners. They're not turning into clients. It's not working. And so the very first thing we always do is SEO. And every single time the results are downloads double within the first month, at least. If not, I had one person that was like a 700% increase in downloads in the first month. Wow. And it just makes such a huge impact in that discoverability. And so going back to my signature ARC method, the attraction, retention, conversion, if you're coming to me and you're telling me I'm not getting clients from my podcast, I don't start with, okay, let's look at your CTAs. Let's look at your placement. Let's look at your establishing your expertise, all of that credibility piece. I don't start there. I start with the attraction piece, because if people are not finding your show and it's not the right people, then the whole domino effect is messed up. It's not going to continue. And so we always start with attraction, then we look at retention, then we focus on conversion.
Yeah.
And so podcast SEO is always the very first place to start because it is so, so powerful. And it's the domino effect for all the other things that we want from our shows.
And in a lot of ways, I feel that you've reverse engineered the typical advice, because I think most gurus or most experts are going to go to that content piece first. And they're going to sometimes say, oh, you just got to keep going and you just got to keep producing shows and just keep doing what you're doing. Eventually it's going to pay off. But it's like, is it? It's not always the case, especially if you are not thinking about that attraction piece first, or you've never paid any mind to that attraction piece at all. It's going to cost you. And I like that looking at it from the reverse angle, it makes all of the right things stand out. And I think that we have to be there with the abundance of options that people have these days, whether they discover what they're looking for through a podcast, through social media, through a blog, through an email newsletter series, through a course, whatever. If you've got the opportunity to deliver that information through a podcast, you have to think about all of the elements that are going to deliver that message and realize that you have tremendous power to deliver a message, move the needle, and then ultimately get a person to be a brand advocate for you forever. But that all starts with them coming through the door and finding what they want. It's like, I came for this party, instead I walked into this, I don't know, political rally that I had no intention of attending. So getting them in the door with that attraction piece and then having the good content that's going to help them understand more about the problem and how they can solve it, that's the name of the game. And it's intricate. There's little pieces along the way. And if you miss even one, I think it can throw somebody off course to where they're going to find somebody else to guide them.
Yeah. And the process is not totally linear, because sometimes, we work on the attraction piece. We've got people coming in the door, and then we're working on that retention piece of getting people to stick around. And then things kind of fall off there. We've made some progress. Maybe there's some refining in the messaging to get people to stick around. Yeah. And then we have to go back to the attraction piece again and be like, okay, now that we've clarified our messaging and content, now we need to do some refining on the attraction piece to make sure we're getting those right people. And so it's never a complete, this is always, step 1, step 2, step 3, and then it's done. It's sometimes step 1, step 2, then back to step 1, and then step 2, step 3, back to step 2. It's a process. Yeah. And I want to touch on something else you said, because a lot of the podcast gurus out there, like you just mentioned, say, just keep going, just keep doing it. And that advice exists because you and I both know that podcasting is a long game. It is not a quick win strategy. You are most likely not going to start a podcast and get a client within a few weeks. You're most likely not going to get thousands and thousands of downloads immediately within the first couple months. And so I think a lot of that advice is out there because there's kernels of truth to it, because you do need to keep going. Yes. You do need to not give up and persevere and just kind of say, okay, it's quiet. I've got crickets. It feels like I'm talking into the void, but that's okay, because I know this is a marathon, not a sprint.
Yeah.
And at the same time, you need to be making some tweaks and changes and experiment along the way, because obviously the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results.
Right.
So it's a combination of, you have to keep going, but you have to make some tweaks while you keep going.
Yeah. And that's, not to say that I in no way, support quitting or stopping, because that's a surefire way to not get anywhere.
Right.
But you got to be thinking about the whole message and the whole picture. So by stopping, you're going to cost yourself a lot of opportunities. And this is why when I work on people with strategy, one of the early things we do before we ever even start recording podcast episodes is defining what small victories are, because you're 100% right, Julia. At first, you have to develop your audience. It's going to take some time. What can you do with your content outside of just building the podcast that could serve other pieces and other parts of your business, other parts of your brand? And instead of having to create that content from scratch, you can utilize this content to potentially reach somebody through a different stream. So what are those potential avenues that we need to explore? Okay, now that we know those, we can build content that speaks to that. So while the podcast starts to gain traction or gets in that position to where it can gain traction, now you've got your content working for you in other places, thus saving you time. So if saving time is a small win, congratulations, you've got yourself a small win. It's things like that that I believe keep people engaged, because if it's all just grinded out every week to see what happens, that can be one of the reasons why people say, you know what, I'm getting burnt out here and I'm really not seeing the results that I thought I would get. I'm done. And unfortunately, we have many statistics that speak to those results. I tell you, ever since I launched Bombtrack Media, I've been on a one-man mission to try to flip that script. What can we do to bring those statistics more towards the positive side? Because anybody that starts a podcast, in my opinion, has something good to bring to the world and probably has some pretty good ideas that need to be shared, but this piece of it is missing, and ultimately leads to them not getting that message spread as far as they could have.
For sure. And I think that this is probably a given, but someone has to be truly passionate about their topic. They kind of can't just see the podcast as purely a business asset or a marketing tool. Yes, it can play that role, but you have to be genuinely excited to show up and, jam about podcast SEO or whatever it is that you love talking about, because you're going to get burnt out really quickly if you don't genuinely enjoy talking about those things, answering the same questions over and over again, addressing topics from different angles, updating industry news, giving all of the different perspectives. And so I think sometimes people start a podcast thinking, oh, this is just going to be easy. It's just going to take a little bit of my time. And then when they realize that it's a little bit more labor intensive, it requires more patience, then they're like, oh, well, maybe I don't want to sit here and talk about this every week for, a year plus. So I think that passion piece also needs to be there.
Yeah. All things that you can address very early in the strategy process, so you can set yourself up for that type of success.
Sure.
Julia, before we wind things down today, let's dive into this SEO piece from the very beginning. Let's say that we've caught somebody listening to today's episode and they are at this very beginning process. They're starting to put their strategy together. They want to do the right thing with SEO to make sure they are set up for that discoverability as soon as possible as they roll their podcast out. So you had mentioned, I know one of the big things that we do need to dive into in that piece is positioning of keywords. And that positioning matters. So let's walk through all of the pieces, and let's just keep this to the SEO part, all of the pieces that we should be thinking about. And I'll be able to incorporate some of the things that I did with my show to complement what you have to say on that. So let's dive into the SEO piece. And brand new podcaster getting started, what should they be looking at first?
So in terms of big picture, podcast SEO strategy is step 1, picking your keywords. Step 2, putting them in strategic places. And step 3, rinse and repeat in terms of the placement. You don't have to pick the keywords again. And so that's kind of it at a high level. I do have an entire course on this. So, unless we want to be here for the next two hours, we can't get into all the details, but I break it down into primary keywords and secondary keywords in terms of positioning and choosing your topics, not topics, but choosing your keywords. And so picking what I refer to as the primary keyword is the most important step. And of course, it's the hardest step in a lot of cases because sometimes it's not quite as clear cut. So for you and I, our primary keyword is podcasting. And so the reason that's our primary keyword is because it is an overarching term that describes our content.
Right.
You and I also have very focused shows. We are very clear about who we are talking to, what we are talking about, and the scope of information that we cover. And so I find a lot of times that students or clients will come to me and they're like, well, I talk a little bit about this, I talk a little bit about that. And especially people who maybe haven't started their shows yet and they're multi-passionate. And so when you have multiple things on the show, it's not quite as cut and dry as you and I just saying, oh, obviously, podcasting is the primary keyword. That's a no-brainer.
Right.
In some cases, it's absolutely a no-brainer. It's similar to ours. But in other cases, it requires some digging. And so that's a process that can involve like keyword research using, formal SEO keyword research tools like Ubersuggest or Keywords Everywhere, like really doing that data research to look at the numbers. It can also involve talking to your audience. And of course, there's that behind the scenes work of maybe narrowing your focus or really getting more clear about who you are talking to and what it is you are leading them towards. What's the ultimate goal of your podcast? So there's a lot of pieces involved, but picking that primary keyword is the number one thing that people need to do first.
Okay. What about where that keyword shows up in the title? And along with that, should we be omitting the word "the" to start our podcast title?
Yes, absolutely. Omit the word "the." Do not include the word "the." That is going to hurt your SEO. And then
why is that? I mean, it seems so strange, but I think I understand why, but explain to the Bomb Squad why that is.
Yeah, so it's just simply a matter of, there's two different things. It's simply a matter of there are so many other podcasts with the word "the" in there at the beginning of the title that it doesn't stand out. It just gets lost in the noise.
Okay.
It also, the way the SEO algorithm works is that it weights words. And so the closer to the beginning of the title a word is, the more powerful it is, the more weight it has in the algorithm. Okay. So you mentioned earlier that you were trying to add an extension. I call it a title extension, but kind of a tagline, a subtitle, whatever you want to call it, onto the end of your main title. Let's blow this up. You were trying to add something on there and it just wasn't working for you. Right. And while it was still in the title field, which I'll pause for a second and say, when we're talking about podcast SEO strategy, the title field is the most powerful field. So you cannot adequately do podcast SEO strategy without changing your title in some way, shape, or form. And so depending on the industry, sometimes it can work to put it in a tagline, put it later on in there. But circling back to why we don't want to use "the" is because the earlier the word is, the more powerful it is. So we don't want to give the most power, the most weight of that first word to the word "the." Yeah. We want to give it to something that is relevant to our industry, that is going to match with searches, that kind of thing. That was a little bit of a roundabout explanation, but hopefully that makes
total sense. And getting around to that point, it makes complete sense. It's, again, people aren't searching the word "the."
Mhm.
They're searching the word podcasting in our case, or whatever your show is about out there. That it's not about the word the. Plus, I think keeping the word the out of it helps you keep the word podcast off the end of it.
Yes. Yes.
Typically, those are going to go hand in hand.
Yes.
All right. So we know the keyword should be as close to the front as possible. Let's talk show notes and show description. What I've learned is that a show description that is keyword rich, not overly stuffed, but has the right keywords properly utilized throughout, plus a few questions that could be long tail keywords that a person might search, that's going to stand out versus something that's a little bit jumbled and maybe a little bit off subject and not as keyword rich. And I think this is the most important part. And I just learned this myself. Show notes don't have the same power as the show description.
Correct.
Israel.
Yes. And this is where we could get into splitting hairs a little bit because each platform works a little bit differently. So on Apple doesn't really put a lot of weight into the show description.
Okay.
But Spotify does. And so obviously you can only have one show description that gets distributed everywhere.
Right.
And so you want to optimize that because Spotify is going to pick up on that and capitalize on it. Kind of the same thing with the show notes, the episode descriptions, the episode specific descriptions. They are not very heavily weighted by either platform at the moment. That can always change.
Very
and
true.
So I always tell people that is the least area of, it's the lowest priority. And so not to focus your efforts there, but throw your keyword, your primary keyword in there once or twice, which shouldn't be hard if you're talking about what your show is about. So, my episodes are about podcasting. It's not hard to put the word podcasting in my show notes because that's what I'm talking about in my episode.
Yeah.
So I don't spend a lot of time or energy there, but it's kind of like a quick check the box. Okay, I got the keyword in there once. Great. Now I'm moving on. Whereas with the show description, I spend more time being much more strategic about what I'm including, where I'm positioning things. You mentioned those like long tail Googleable questions. Those belong in there as well for sure. And then, I mentioned earlier that I teach primary keywords and secondary keywords. So we don't even have time to dive into the secondary keywords, but that is a factor as well that goes into the show description itself.
Okay. It's funny because I wanted to bring this up because I had worked with somebody in the past, and there's that old saying of that how's it go? You're recording for your podcast, but you're writing for Google. And it was something like that. And he told me, and I never believed it. And I never saw it. When I tried it a few times, I was like, I don't see the purpose of this. Literally using every character in the show notes portion. So I think Buzzsprout gives you 2,000 characters. You should be using all of them. And that is going to help with visibility. I don't believe that to be true. I thought it was crazy when I heard it. It seemed like a big waste of time, especially when someone goes to their podcast app and now there's a book in front of them about the show, where the idea is for them to listen to the podcast. Yes, they can read the show notes and get a pretty good summary of what they're about to consume. But if it's something to where most people don't have that kind of time.
Right.
So give me something quick. So that news, and that's what I'm saying. Like, I like hearing this because I always thought that was crap, and it's good to know that I'm not the only one.
Yeah, and of course, I'll put the disclaimer that this stuff is changing on a weekly, monthly basis, and so who knows what the answer to that might be in the future.
Very true.
At this point, it's not weighted in the search algorithm very heavily at all. And the primary purpose, like you just said, is for the listener. The purpose of the show notes is first and foremost, to get the listener to press play on the episode. And then second, to serve as a reference point for anything that you may have mentioned in the episode. So we know podcasters, podcast listeners are typically multitasking. And so, oh, what was that thing Jason mentioned again? Let me go look in the show notes for that link or that code or, whatever it was. Yeah. So that's how I see the show notes, and that's how I approach it.
Very important to make people realize as we sit and record, it is April 14th, 2026. This show will come out later than that. So yeah, if you're finding this episode and at 2027, we could be way off and show notes are all
Absolutely.
the rage. But as we sit and talk, we can only go off what we've learned.
Correct.
One last point that I want to talk about, and I give full credit to the guys on the podcasting morning chat, guys and girls that talked about this subject. It was something I tried, and I think it was a coincidence, but it was just funny how it all worked out. They had talked about the author field, and in most cases, I know up till I heard this tip, I just had my name in that field. And when they talked about adding your title and having a keyword in the author title, I said, or in the author field, I said, okay, that makes sense. So I added Podcasting Strategist, which is my title. The next day is when I finally ranked. I was like, wow, those guys are good.
But not a coincidence.
Do you think it was that fast of a transition?
Yes, 100%.
Wow.
Yep.
Okay.
And so again, each platform kind of has their own things, but Apple prioritizes the title of your show, the author field, and then your episode titles. Those are the three that they prioritize. Now, again, Spotify is a little bit different, and so we can't just optimize for one of them.
Right.
But that author field holds a lot of weight. And so, yes, putting your primary keyword of podcasting into that title field, into that author field, absolutely had an impact on your ranking.
All right. Well, again, thanks to Mark Ronick and the crew over at the Podcasting Morning Chat. I appreciate the guidance. And again, I think it's a great tip for everybody. It also, in a lot of ways, will help identify you as that resource that a person might be looking for. So not only is it serving the SEO field, but just from that visibility piece and that credibility piece, there's a lot of miles that you can get out of that. And it's so freaking simple.
Yep. It's a one and done.
Right.
Set it and forget it.
Exactly. Well, Julia, this has been phenomenal. I mean, I hesitate to even ask the question like this because we've just spent over 45 minutes diving deep into the podcast SEO part of this whole game. If there was one thing that you would recommend to anybody that is struggling with this particular aspect that they could do today, what would you say they should do to start changing and getting things going in the right direction?
Well, that's a bit
go
of
back and listen to the first 45 minutes of this podcast. See, that's what I'm saying. It's a hard one to answer because we've covered so damn much today.
Well, I was going to say, if at this point in the episode they are still stuck, they probably need to contact one of us for support.
Amen to that.
To be completely honest there. And that's not to say that, they're doing anything wrong. No, sometimes this is tricky and nuanced. And I have had people where we've had to try a keyword, see what happens, and then go, nope, that wasn't it. Let's go back to the drawing board and try again. So it's not a failure if they need to reach out for help. We are both happy to help with that. 100%. But I think one of the things that I hear a lot, especially from existing podcasters, is they say, well, I already have 200 episodes. You alluded to this earlier with the sunk cost fallacy. And so the message that I would like to leave listeners with is just that it's never too late to start doing this. And everything on your podcast is changeable. So you could go back and change old episode titles if you wanted to. Not that you have to, but if you wanted to. So for someone who's really deep into this, it is never too late to start doing it, and it absolutely will make an impact.
Thank you for bringing up that point. And I will say that I had similar thoughts with my back catalog of let's blow this up. What do I do with this? Do I change the titles? Do I change the show covers? And then I started thinking, well, this show was what it was until I decided to make this change. So the easiest thing I could think to do was I just recorded a quick 15-second dynamic alert that I could insert into all of the episodes of Let's Blow This Up, explaining this show is now called Podcasting Strategy Simplified, but what you've stumbled upon is a great episode from when it was called Let's Blow This Up. I hope you enjoy what's ahead of you and check out more of the catalog. So now there's at least a little bit of a message that maybe someone that did stumble upon the show because of the old name, now they at least have an understanding. And I will say that's one of my biggest surprises since rebranding the show. I don't know the exact number right now. Like I'm probably at 10, 11, at least as you and I sit here and talk, of new episodes under the new name. My emphasis has been there, obviously, but I've been watching now that the numbers are, I mean, I've been seeing more and more listenership, but a lot of it is exploring that back catalog. So even though the show is no longer called Let's Blow This Up, I got people going back and listening to, I mean, I just looked today, there was a few people that dug into episode 1 from season 1. So to speak to Julia's point, if you don't, if you're worried about that sunk cost fallacy, if you're worried about, oh my gosh, I've got so much content under this name, what's it going to do if I change things up? It's going to be helpful for you going forward if you feel like you're stuck, and that back catalog does not lose value because you change to a new name.
Yes, 100%. Because now people know what those episodes are about.
Exactly right. Yes, now the discoverability piece is in place, everybody wins. Man, Julia, I feel like we could keep going on this for hours, but we should probably put a bow on things. So first, I'd like to thank you for joining me here on Podcasting Strategy Simplified. Give the Bomb Squad one good place that they can find you for more value.
Thank you so much for having me today, Jason. I have really enjoyed this conversation. I could jam out about podcast SEO all day long.
We'll bring you back for a part 2.
We covered so much stuff here today. And so if anyone wants a kind of condensed version of what we just talked about and kind of a cheat sheet, I do have that. You can go to thepodcastteacher.com/SEO kit, SEO kit, and that will give you kind of everything we just talked about in a nice reference format that you can come back to again and again and get your podcast optimized.
Absolutely. That will be linked in the show notes to make it very easy for the Bomb Squad to access. Julia, again, thank you so much for all of the wisdom that you brought to the show, and we'll have to bring you back and do it again.
Sounds great. Thank you.
And to the Bomb Squad, thank you so much for being here for another episode of Podcasting Strategy Simplified. My name is Jason Sircone. Until our paths cross again on the next episode, remember, podcasting isn't easy, but it doesn't need to be complicated. We'll see you next time.